In the early 1950s, a doctor working in a rural clinic tucked into the Western Pyrenees ran a routine blood test on a pregnant woman and found something that made him check his equipment twice. The result did not match anything he expected to see in that region. He assumed contamination, ran it again, and got the same answer. Word spread to a handful of physicians working in nearby valleys, and within a few years a pattern too large to dismiss as a lab error had emerged. The villages scattered across this stretch of land straddling the border of France and Spain were producing blood test results that did not resemble their Spanish neighbors to the south, their French neighbors to the north, or frankly anyone else on the continent. For doctors delivering babies in the region, this was not an abstract curiosity. Rh incompatibility between a mother and her unborn child can cause dangerous complications, sometimes fatal ones, and suddenly physicians were staring at blood chemistry that broke every regional expectation they had been trained on. That unease, born out of maternity wards rather than university laboratories, became the opening thread of one of the strangest unresolved stories in European history. The people at the center of it are the Basques, and what started as a medical oddity would eventually pull in linguists, archaeologists, and finally geneticists, armed with tools nobody in that clinic could have imagined. What made that clinical discovery so unsettling was not just its rarity, but its medical weight. Rh-negative blood is not a cosmetic quirk. When an Rh-negative mother carries an Rh-positive baby, her immune system can begin producing antibodies against the child's blood cells, a condition doctors call hemolytic disease of the newborn, which in the era before modern treatment could be fatal for the infant. A concentration of Rh-negative blood as high as the one found in isolated Basque valleys meant obstetric wards that were dealing with a medical reality genuinely different from clinics just a short drive away in Pamplona or Bordeaux. That practical, immediate stake is part of why the anomaly did not stay a quiet academic footnote. Physicians needed to understand it to treat their patients safely, and the deeper they looked, the less it resembled a simple statistical fluke. Over the following years, larger surveys covering thousands of individuals across the wider Basque region confirmed the original readings again and again, ruling out the possibility that a handful of unusual families in one valley had simply skewed the early numbers. The Basque homeland sits folded into the western end of the Pyrenees, spilling across the modern border that separates Spain from France without paying much attention to it. Long before anyone drew that border, this was already a distinct cultural pocket, and the people living there spoke, and still speak, a language called Euskara. To understand why that single fact unsettled linguists for over a century, you have to understand what nearly every other language in Europe has in common. Almost the entire linguistic map of the continent, from Portuguese in the west to Russian in the east, from Icelandic in the north to Greek in the south, descends from a single ancestral language known as Proto-Indo-European. Most linguists place its origin among pastoral communities on the Eurasian steppe, likely in the region north of the Black and Caspian Seas, sometime around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. As those communities expanded, their speech split into branches, those branches split into families, and those families eventually produced the roughly 450 languages spoken by nearly half the world's population today. English is part of that tree. So is Hindi. So is Persian, spoken thousands of kilometers away. Nearly every language a European speaks today can be traced, however distantly, back to that same steppe origin. Euskara refuses to fit anywhere on that tree. It is what linguists call a language isolate, meaning it has no demonstrated relative, living or dead, anywhere on Earth. This is not a small technical footnote. Linguists have spent well over 100 years trying to locate a sister language for Euskara, digging through old inscriptions, comparing vocabulary lists, hunting for any thread connecting it to Iberian, to the Aquitanian language, once spoken in Roman-era Gaul, even to languages spoken thousands of kilometers away in the Caucasus. Every serious attempt has failed to produce anything resembling consensus. The strongest candidate relative anyone has proposed is Aquitanian, a language known only from a handful of personal names carved into Roman-era inscriptions found in what is now southwestern France. And most linguists treat Aquitanian less as a separate discovery and more as an earlier stage of Basque itself, which still leaves the language with no true external relative at all. Broader proposals connecting Euskara to the Caucasus, to ancient Iberian scripts found on the eastern coast of Spain, or to a wider hypothetical grouping of pre-Indo-European Mediterranean languages, have all been floated over the decades, and every one of them has failed to survive rigorous scrutiny. Euskara stands alone, the only language isolate left standing in Western Europe. When Rome conquered Iberia, beginning in the late 3rd century BCE, and held it for over 600 years, it left an unmistakable linguistic fingerprint almost everywhere it went. Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian, Catalan, and Romanian all descend directly from spoken Latin. Basque absorbed Latin loanwords, plenty of them, but it kept its own grammar, its own core vocabulary, and its own way of counting, using a base 20 system rather than the base 10 system used across the rest of the continent. Numbers like that are among the most resistant features in any language, rarely borrowed, rarely replaced, which is part of why their divergence from every neighboring system stood out so sharply to researchers. For decades, the blood work described earlier sat next to the language puzzle like a second half of the same riddle nobody could solve. Basque populations were found to carry the highest documented concentration of Rh-negative blood anywhere in the world, with some isolated valleys showing close to half the population testing negative, compared with roughly 15% across the broader European population. Type O blood also appeared at unusually high frequency. Blood type distributions are not fixed points. They shift and blend as populations intermarry with their neighbors over generations. The fact that Basque communities had held on to such an extreme distribution for so long told researchers one thing clearly. Whoever these people were, they had not been mixing much with the populations around them for a very long time. What it could not tell them was why or since when or where they had originally come from. Two competing theories dominated the field for most of the 20th century. One camp argued the Basques were the last direct descendants of the hunter-gatherer populations that occupied Western Europe before farming ever arrived, a Paleolithic remnant that had somehow dodged absorption through thousands of years of subsequent migrations. The other camp argued they were relatively later arrivals from an unidentified origin point, who only became isolated after settling into the mountains. Blood chemistry alone could never settle that argument. It could describe the present, but it had nothing to say about the past. Some anthropologists went further still, pointing to skull measurements and skeletal traits from Basque cemeteries, and arguing they detected a direct physical line running back to the Cro-Magnon populations, who painted the cave walls of nearby Altamira and Lascaux tens of thousands of years earlier. That version of the story, romantic as it sounds, was built on measurement techniques that later genetics would show were far too blunt to support such a specific claim. It kept the public imagination occupied for decades, even while serious researchers grew increasingly cautious about it, and it is part of why so much popular writing about the Basques leans on dramatic, half-supported claims rather than the more careful picture that eventually emerged from the DNA itself. Everything changed when scientists developed the ability to extract and sequence genetic material directly from ancient teeth and bone. This is where the story stops being a matter of comparing modern blood samples and becomes a matter of reading directly from the source. And one of the pivotal moments came from a 2019 study published in Science, led by researchers including Inigo Olalde, which analyzed genome-wide data pulled from 271 ancient individuals recovered across the Iberian Peninsula, spanning roughly 8,000 years of history. The study traced successive waves of migration into Iberia, early farmers arriving from Anatolia, then pastoralist groups sweeping in from the Pontic-Caspian steppe during the Bronze Age, carrying their genetic signatures and, quite possibly, early Indo-European speech patterns with them, then later contributions from North African populations and from Rome's imperial reach. Layer after layer, the genetic composition of Iberia kept shifting, generation after generation, as new groups arrived and blended with those already there. And in the middle of all that churn, one population stood apart. The Basques, the study concluded, were best described as a population that had essentially frozen in place during the Iron Age, retaining that genetic profile largely undisturbed by the admixture events that reshaped almost everyone else on the peninsula afterward. The researchers were careful to flag something that complicates the simplest version of this story. The Basques were not untouched by the steppe migrations widely credited with spreading early Indo-European speech across the continent. Their Iron Age ancestors carried that same steppe-related ancestry as their neighbors did. What makes them unusual is not an absence of that earlier layer, but the near total absence of everything that came afterward, the layers that reshaped nearly every other population on the peninsula in the centuries that followed. That finding was dramatic enough on its own, but it raised a follow-up question that a broader sampling effort was needed to answer. Was this apparent continuity really as deep and as clean as it looked, and what specifically was keeping it that way? In 2021, a team led by geneticist David Comas at the Institute of Evolutionary Biology, a joint center of the Spanish Research Council, CSIC, and Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona, published the most detailed genomic study of the Basque population ever undertaken in the journal Current Biology. The scale of the sampling was deliberately rigorous. Researchers analyzed more than 600,000 genetic markers across individuals drawn from the entire Franco-Cantabrian region, the broader zone spanning both Euskara-speaking and non-Euskara-speaking communities on both sides of the French-Spanish border. And they were careful to select participants whose recent ancestry could be traced firmly to that specific area. So the results reflected deep local history rather than the noise of recent movement. They compared that dataset against ancient DNA and against nearly 2,000 individuals sampled from populations spread across Europe and the Mediterranean basin. The results overturned the old migration theory almost entirely. There was no hidden founding population arriving from some undiscovered homeland. No lost group quietly slipping their genes into the mountains before disappearing from the historical record. Instead, the data revealed continuity, extraordinary and largely unbroken, stretching back through the Iron Age. The genetic signature recovered from that period is remarkably close to the genetic signature of Basque communities living today. Compare that to the rest of the Iberian Peninsula, where a few centuries of migration, conquest, and settlement is typically enough to noticeably reshape a population's genetic composition. A person living in central Spain today typically carries a genetic mixture reflecting Roman-era settlement, several centuries of Visigothic rule, roughly 7 centuries of Islamic presence in the south following the 8th century conquest, earlier Neolithic farming migrants, and the steppe pastoralists who arrived thousands of years before any of that. All of it layered together and reshaped the genetic map of the peninsula repeatedly. The Basque population absorbed almost none of it. While the rest of the continent's genetic landscape kept being rewritten, theirs stayed remarkably still. Once the broad pattern of continuity was established, researchers pushed further to understand the mechanism behind it, and this is where the story takes its most surprising turn. The isolation was not simply a passive result of geography. The Pyrenees are genuine mountains, difficult terrain in places, but they were never impassable. Roman soldiers crossed them, medieval merchants crossed them, pilgrims walking the routes to Santiago de Compostela crossed directly through Basque territory for centuries. Armies, traders, and travelers moved through those valleys constantly throughout recorded history. So geography by itself cannot explain the genetic wall the data revealed. What the 2021 study found instead was that language itself functioned as the actual barrier. Communities where Euskara had been spoken continuously through history showed the strongest genetic differentiation from their neighbors. Communities where the language had once been spoken but was gradually abandoned over time showed an intermediate genetic profile, evidence of gradual mixing creeping in as the linguistic boundary eroded. And communities where Euskara had never taken hold at all, even within the same broader Franco-Cantabrian region, showed genetic profiles blending far more closely with neighboring Spanish and French populations. The correlation between where the language survived and where the genetic distinctiveness survived was, according to the researchers, strikingly precise. The finding goes even further down to the level of individual valleys. Different Basque dialects spoken in valleys separated by only a handful of kilometers correlate with genetically distinguishable subpopulations. Researchers found they could predict with meaningful accuracy which dialect a person's ancestors likely spoke using nothing but their DNA. Communities separated by no more than 15 kilometers showed genetic differences large enough that you would typically expect to find them between populations located on opposite ends of a continent, not between 2 neighboring mountain valleys sharing the same broader culture. The Roncal Valley in Navarre offers one clear example. Home to a distinct Basque dialect and a shepherding tradition, where the local genetic profile has remained essentially stable for over 1,000 years. Historical marriage records, surviving from as far back as the 16th century, show that more than 9 out of every 10 Basques married within their own dialect group, not simply within the broader Basque-speaking world, but within the specific linguistic variant native to their own valley. The language was not a side effect of the isolation. It was the mechanism producing it, generation after generation, one household at a time. There's a deeper cultural layer beneath the genetics that helps explain how a pattern like this could hold for 2,000 years without collapsing under the ordinary pressures of trade, war, and migration. Traditional Basque inheritance customs, especially in rural areas, concentrated family land and property within a single household line, often passed to one designated heir, regardless of birth order or gender, which discouraged the kind of outward marriage that typically scatters family wealth and pulls communities apart. Basque women historically held property rights and social standing that had few parallels elsewhere in medieval Europe, meaning marriage decisions were frequently a matter of personal and family choice within the community, rather than families exchanging daughters outward for political alliances. The practice that reliably introduced outside genetic material into most other European populations over time. Basque folklore adds another layer of evidence entirely separate from genetics or linguistics. Figures like Mari, an earth and mountain deity tied to caves and storms, and a wide cast of nature spirits populate traditional Basque mythology in ways that predate the religious frameworks brought in by Indo-European speaking cultures and by later Christianization. None of this is simply charming folklore sitting off to the side of the real story. It is an independent line of evidence coming from a completely different field of study, pointing toward the exact same conclusion that the genetics and the linguistics were already suggesting. Even Basque legal tradition reinforced the pattern. Certain historic Basque territories operated under their own charters, known as fueros, which granted local communities a degree of self-governance and customary law distinct from the surrounding Spanish and French crowns for centuries, reinforcing a sense of a separate, self-contained world long before anyone had the tools to measure it in a genome. Three completely separate disciplines, working from three completely separate kinds of evidence, kept arriving at the same place. Step back and consider what this means against the backdrop of the rest of Europe. Most of the continent's genetic history reads like a manuscript that has been overwritten again and again. Early farming populations, arriving from the eastern Mediterranean roughly 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, displaced or absorbed the hunter-gatherer populations who had occupied Europe since the end of the last ice age. Bronze Age pastoralists, sweeping in from the Pontic-Caspian steppe starting around 5,000 years ago, reshaped the genetic composition of nearly the entire continent, and quite likely brought early Indo-European speech with them. Then came the Roman conquests, the Germanic migrations that followed Rome's decline, the Slavic expansions further east, and centuries of steady, unspectacular intermarriage that never really stopped through the medieval period and beyond. Each wave laid another layer over what came before, until the original genetic signature of pre-farming, pre-steppe Europe was almost entirely buried beneath everything that followed. Almost entirely. Geneticists studying the Basque population increasingly describe it as something close to a genetic refuge, a population that absorbs so little of these successive migrations that its genome still preserves a signature of the continent closer to how it existed before the great overwriting began. That has made Basque populations a genuinely valuable resource for medical and population genetics research, well beyond the historical curiosity of the story. Because the population is so unusually unmixed compared with the rest of Europe, researchers studying the genetic basis of certain diseases and biological traits have found that Basque samples offer a clearer, less noisy signal, since centuries of intermixing have not blurred the data the way it has almost everywhere else on the continent. What once looked like nothing more than an isolated curiosity tucked into a mountain range has become an active resource for understanding human genetics more broadly. Population geneticists sometimes compare working with a genetically homogeneous group like this to reducing background noise in a recording. In a heavily admixed population, a disease-linked genetic variant can get obscured by dozens of unrelated ancestry signals layered on top of it. In a population with unusually little of that layering, the same variant stands out far more clearly, which is exactly why isolated founder populations, from the Basques to Iceland to Finland, keep showing up again and again in serious biomedical research. That thread runs directly into the present, into ordinary people living today in Bilbao, in Bayonne, in San Sebastian, in the smaller towns and shepherding valleys scattered across the region, each one carrying a genetic continuity documented in some of the most detailed population genetics research ever conducted anywhere. That is not a romantic exaggeration written for effect. It is a measurable, published, peer-reviewed finding. It's worth being precise about what the science does and does not claim, because the real story is arguably more interesting than the more dramatic version, sometimes repeated online. Basques are not some genetically alien population unconnected to their neighbors, nor are they simple, unchanged holdovers from the Ice Age with no more recent history. The 2019 Science study and the 2021 Current Biology study both describe the Basque population as fundamentally a typical Iron Age Iberian population, one shaped by the same early farmer and steppe pastoralist migrations that shaped the rest of the peninsula thousands of years ago. What sets them apart is not some separate origin from a different world. What sets them apart is what happened, or rather what did not happen after that point. While the rest of Iberia and the rest of Europe kept absorbing new populations through the Roman period, the Visigothic period, the centuries of Islamic rule in the south, and the long churn of medieval trade and conquest, the Basque-speaking core of the Pyrenees largely did not. They are not visitors from an unknown place. They are, in a very real sense, a population that stayed home while nearly everyone else around them kept moving, mixing, and being reshaped. After all of this research, the explanation that keeps surfacing is not the mountains. That would be the easy, comfortable answer, and it does not hold up against the evidence. Populations elsewhere in the world have lived behind mountain ranges considerably more forbidding than the Pyrenees, and still saw their genetic makeup transformed within a handful of centuries because mountains slow down armies but do very little to stop trade routes, wandering merchants, or the slow cultural pull that neighboring societies exert on one another across generations. Pilgrims, soldiers, and traders walked straight through Basque territory for 2,000 years without dissolving it. What the evidence actually points to is something closer to sustained, repeated collective choice. Generation after generation, communities in this region chose to marry within the language, chose to pass property down established family lines rather than trading it outward, and maintained social customs tight enough that outside influence rarely found an easy way in. Language functioned as the boundary that made all of that possible, but the language itself had to be actively taught to every new generation and deliberately kept alive through centuries in which abandoning it and blending quietly into the surrounding Spanish or French-speaking world would have been considerably easier. There is something worth sitting with in that detail beyond the purely scientific interest. It suggests that cultural identity, when it is actively maintained and deliberately passed forward rather than left to chance, can outlast almost any physical barrier humans have ever built, including one of the most significant mountain ranges in Western Europe. The genetics did not make the mystery of the Basque people disappear once scientists finally had the tools to look directly at ancient DNA. If anything, the genetics confirmed that the mystery had been real the entire time, and gave it a level of precision the blood tests of the 1950s could never have provided. What those researchers ultimately handed back was not a tidy, simple answer explaining away a strange population in the mountains. It was proof, published and peer-reviewed, that a community can remain measurably, recognizably itself across more than 2,000 years of pressure, invasion, and transformation happening on every side of it, not through isolation by geographic accident, but through choices renewed continuously across roughly 100 generations of people who decided that their language and their identity were worth the effort of keeping. That, more than the blood work, more than the vigesimal counting system, more than any single genetic marker, is what makes the story of the Basque people genuinely remarkable. Not simply that they survived, because plenty of ancient European populations survived in some diluted, half-remembered form, but that they survived intact, still speaking a language traced to nowhere else on Earth, still recognizably, unmistakably themselves. Think about how rare that actually is once you set it against the rest of human history. Empires rise and dissolve within a few centuries. Languages spoken by millions of people vanish within a couple of generations once a more dominant neighbor moves in. Entire genetic lineages get folded into larger populations so thoroughly that within 1,000 years, almost no trace of the original group remains distinguishable in the data at all. Against that backdrop, a population sitting in a modest stretch of mountains between two much larger nations, never building an empire of its own, never conquering its neighbors, managed to keep its language, its customs, and its underlying genetic signature recognizable across roughly 2,000 years of exactly the kind of pressure that erased almost everyone else's version of the same story. They did it without writing it down as some grand nationalist project, at least not for most of that span. They did it through the quiet, repeated, almost invisible act of choosing a partner who spoke the way they did, teaching a child the old words instead of the easier ones, and keeping a household's land in the family rather than trading it away for advantage. That is worth remembering the next time the story gets flattened into a headline about mysterious ancient DNA or a hidden lost civilization in the mountains. Because the far more interesting truth is that there was no hidden civilization and no secret migration waiting to be uncovered. There was simply a group of people who never stopped being themselves, generation after generation, long enough for the science to eventually catch up and confirm what the blood tests, the vigesimal counting system, and the unclassifiable language had already been hinting at for a very long time.